Good question. Yeah, so as Kelly said, been here a couple of times and grateful to be back. And in the past, we did go through an exercise where we made sieves. And as Kelly mentioned, there are a few of you that are still using your sieves. If you haven't made sieves, I do have a few of them. So you can go home with them. You don't have to make your own. But this is where it is that we can separate out those aggregates. How many of you ever seen the clod test or the slake test where you take a clod of soil and you put it in water, or you put it on top of a screen that's sitting in water? Okay. So this is the same type of thing that we're trying to do, but when that clod, inside that clod are a bunch of aggregates. And so if we can separate out those aggregates as opposed to just looking at the clod, sometimes you'll see that the clod test doesn't really, like many science experiments, doesn't really perform the way that you wanted it to perform. So it doesn't quite work when you try and do it as a demonstration. And part of that is that the way that those clods are formed is through a physical and a geological process as well. Whereas when we're looking primarily at the aggregates that we're going to separate out from the soils, that is going to allow us to be looking at something that's more biologically formed and biologically active. And so there's a better correlation oftentimes with aggregate stability and different types of soil health parameters and other types of indicators. So I want to encourage you, if you haven't, like I said, I have a few that are left over from another time that I did this, so you can take these home with you. And basically all you have to do, there's a screen with some large wide openings and a screen with some smaller openings. The openings here are about 2 millimeters and the openings here are about 1 millimeter. You're going to pass the soil through this screen. What comes through that screen and gets collected, you can pass it through this screen, and then what stays on this screen are going to be the 1 to 2 millimeter aggregates. So a lot of what Jimmy was showing, those aggregates that you could see, are going to be what's going to get collected on here. And then you can take what's on here and just put them in a dish and add water to it, and you can see how well those aggregates are going to stay together or how much they're going to fall apart. So I think this is a really cool exercise for you to do. And again, when I've been over here in the past, we've made these. It's just PVC pipe and some glue and the screen. And you can get the screens at Canadian Tire. The small screen is the no-seam screen. So, you want to go if you're looking someplace else than Canadian Tire, for those of you who don't go to Canadian Tire on a regular basis. This is basically small insect screening, and this is sort of a standard window screening that you have. It works better if it's a plastic mesh because it's easier to cut and easier to deal with than metal mesh, but you can do that with metal. If you want to make these more permanent, because the glue does kind of break down, they're not permanent, but you just re-glue them. If you want to make them more permanent, you can either use metal pipe. So if you want to invest in that, solder metal screening on there. It's the same thing. That's what I buy in the research lab. It costs me about between $70 to $120 per screen for one of these if I buy them made out of metal. So I make them myself when I'm trying to do experiments in the lab, and this is actually tools we do use in a research lab. So yeah, I'm going to leave these out there and out here, and you can come up and get them. One of the things that I want to do before I get started talking about some things is that I want to kind of what Jimmy was showing and what Jay talked a lot about of the value of aggregates and what aggregates can do for you, and how this is helping us to create porosity to manage water. So I need 4 volunteers, because we're going to do a little bit of a fun thing. Oh, come on. I know it's the afternoon, but we can do this. Come on up here. I need 2 more. I got 2 from this side of the room, so let's go over here. Okay. I'm going to call on the guy who volunteered the other guy. So if you're going to be the volunteerer, all right, and I need 1 more. And you know what? I'm going to grab you from AFC. Yeah.
Banker, yay!
Yes, bankers got to understand this. I've actually done this for my dad's banker to try and show that if you get healthy soil, this is the advantages that you can have in helping us to manage water. So what we're going to try and do is just sort of get an understanding about how porosity impacts water. So we're going to be, let's see, this is on the
It's all on the same side.
We're all going to be on the same side.
Okay.
And you got to pick a hand.
Right.
All right.
Okay.
So you're going to end up with that one. So what you've got there are two different sponges, and one sponge is going to be more porous. It's like a real sponge. And the other sponge is not quite as porous. We don't have as good a porosity. And so the other two of you are going to be my holders. So I'm going to give you one
Okay, good.
and give you one. And then what I want you to do is you're just going to put the sponges into the water. And the first thing that we're going to see is, and you can push them down, but the first thing we're going to see is sort of looking at infiltration. So how fast the water got absorbed into one sponge or the other sponge. And you can see pretty quickly this one is already saturated that you've got here. And that one, you're holding it down and you're trying really
Wants
hard.
to float.
But it wants to float, doesn't it? So we're not getting the water moving into that environment because we don't have a lot of pore space. And the other advantage of the pore space we have in this type of a sponge is as you look at it, the holes aren't all the same size. You want to have a wide variety of diameters of that hole space. And that's what the aggregates are going to do. It's kind of like making a plumbing system for a house, where instead of going from like an 8-inch pipe to a 6-inch pipe to a 4-inch pipe to a 2-inch to a 1-inch to a half-inch type of thing, you go from 8-inch to half-inch to 2-inch to 1-inch to 6-inch to 8-inch to 2-inch to half-inch all over the house. And if you did that, and that's how the plumbing was set up in your house, you're going to have, very quickly, you're going to start to smell stuff. Because the water is going to settle in there. It's going to take too much force to try and push the water through all of those different diameters of pipe. And that's what's happening, is it's basically an intricate plumbing system in the ground that's between those aggregates. And the more you have that intricate plumbing system, and the more you have these different diameters of pipe, the more water you can infiltrate, how fast the water is going to get in, and how much more water you can hold. And at the same time, you can infiltrate more water, but you can also hold more water. That's why I said it would start to sting, because you're going to be holding water. So I'm going to give you this cup, you that cup. What I want you to do is pick up the sponges and hold them over the cup. Don't squeeze, just hold. So what we have here is the water that's going to come out of, it's called gravitational water or evaporative water, and it's the amount of water that's going to come out of the soil. Gravity is constantly pulling water out of the profile. Sunlight's constantly pulling it out of the profile to evaporative forces. And so as you can see, with the larger pore space, we do get more water coming out through the bottom. So I'm going to take this away from you, and I'm going to have you grab that little cup and hold that. And I'm going to give you that cup. Yep, we're going to do the same. Thank you very much. So you can take that one. And then I want you now to squeeze into this other cup. So this is our water holding capacity. Again, what's going to be held in that intricate plumbing system between all of those pipes. You could try it too. You could try squeeze. So what we've got here is a really good illustration of the difference of what's going to happen when we have a lot of porosity in our soil. Now, if you have a very sandy soil, you're going to end up having a soil where you're going to have large pores and a lot of the water is going to flow through really quickly. So you can have good infiltration rates, but the water is just going to rush right through. So in Jimmy's soil, where he has a lot of sand, The water could get in, but it's gonna just rush right through. Whereas if you've got the aggregate structure and the organic matter, and that more intricate pipe system that is making the different diameters of the connections between, so the pipes of different diameters, connecting those pore spaces, you're gonna be able to hold more water than the water that you would lose by having that system. And then, you know, sorry. It just is what it is.
It's not good.
So if we've got those compacted zones, and that was where Jimmy talked about, you know, that it's the same thing. If you try and push a root through that, the root's gonna go through that, root's not gonna go through that. Push a soil probe, it's the same thing. That pore space, that open space, just kind of allows for things to move those aggregates aside and the roots to grow between those aggregates and into that pore space, or for your shovel or your probe to be able to get in there. So it's a really good kind of understanding, and again, this then goes to runoff too when you're looking at it. You have a really sandy soil, water's gonna run through, get into your groundwater, pollute your groundwater, or you don't have very good pores and the water's gonna run off. So again, I did this for my dad's banker once, and we talked about this with what he was doing, because it's like, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Putting on cover crops and spending this money on seed, because this is what it's gonna do for me.
Kris,
And how it's gonna build that resilience.
doesn't the carbon help the filtering effect of the water as it moves down through there?
Yes.
As well for aquifer
Yep.
cleanliness?
Yep. So yeah, you can't really see it that well because my sponges keep getting reused all the time, so it's a little bit dirty. I don't clean my sponges well, obviously. But if it was a real sponge that was made from carbon constituents, what we would do is we would be able to see that absorption. Carbon is the ultimate filter. It's the ultimate buffer. The best air and water filters on the planet are carbon-based. Why? Because they're the ultimate filtration system. Carbon is able to bind a variety of different types of chemicals and make sure that they're not going to get into the water or into the air. So thank you very much to my volunteers, your assistance.
Good job.
So I do these things just because I think that, one, it helps to illustrate some of these points. And again, you know, it's something kind of fun to do. So like with the sieves, part of the reason why I enjoy doing these things is because I want you to pay it forward. Utilize it in some way. I do this a lot with kids and young people because you want people to understand why it is we're doing the things that we're doing. And this why is a big part of what it is that I'm going to be talking about and trying to connect. As I said about the roller crimper tool, when we understand why something works, it helps us to understand why we're going to select that tool and what's going to happen with that tool and what we might have to do to help to recarbonize the soil as a result of utilizing that tool. There is no good and bad in anything that we're talking about. Nematodes were on the picture. People would get really scared seeing a nematode there. There are more predatory nematodes that help to balance the populations of fungi and bacteria than there are plant pathogenic nematodes. Same thing is true for insects. Jonathan Lundgren's entomologist. Why is I have a really bad cold, so I'm going to say that as my excuse. My brain is not working right. But entomologist, I was almost there. Entomologist in South Dakota. He runs Blue Dasher Farms. So he's a farmer and a researcher at the same time. And he said that roughly when you're looking at insect populations, it's about a 1,700 to 1 ratio. 1,700 insects that do good things to 1 bad thing. We've got this ability, again, for the system to be able to address many of the things that we're looking for. So I want to do a couple of different things while I'm talking. And if you can get the lights, Kelly, that'd be great. One of them is to talk a little bit about the Living Labs project, because I am involved with the Living Labs project. And it's a really exciting opportunity for us and for myself as a researcher to be able to get data and information about what's going on in your systems. But as a research scientist, I'm not going to come along and say, excuse me, I'm going to take this off because it's far easier to talk loud. I'm not going to come along and say to you, you have to do this practice. You have to use these tools. And so one of the things that I want to do, I'm going to go through a few things rather quickly because I'm here. I live in Canada now. I'm from the US originally, but I'm living in Calgary. So I can come out here again. And I do want to have some time at the end where the three of us can maybe walk through some different scenarios on how you would choose various tools or practices to use. Because we all come to these things and we hear these people talking and it's like, oh, that's so cool, and I saw this stuff and it was great, and you know, I saw these aggregates and I saw these microbes, and how do I get that, and what am I going to do, and where do I start? And then we go home and it's winter time and it's the holidays. You go through the holidays, it's the first of the year. You got to think about what you're going to be planting, you know, what you're going to be doing in a couple of months, and then all of a sudden it's here. And you just end up doing the same thing. So what we want to do is really try and think about how it is that we can think about things from the perspective, and Kelly sort of said, I was asked this question about what kind of a microbe that I would want to be. One of the things that I want to challenge us all to be doing is to think about the system from the perspective of the microbe. From the perspective of the idea of recarbonization. We have one problem in agriculture, one, only one. Our one problem in agriculture is that we do not have enough soil. We do not have enough carbon. Soil is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen bound to sand, silt, and clay. You resolve that problem, and the issues that you have, the challenges that you have, will be resolving themselves. But we have to address the problem. And part of the frustration, my dad's a farmer in southwestern Minnesota. I grew up in an agricultural family, multi-generation agricultural family. And part of the issue that we really have, the thing that has done the most harm to agriculture since agriculture started 30 to 40,000 years ago, is that we supplanted the idea of soil and soil health with the Y word. So I say we have one problem and we have one word that has done the most harm to all of us, and it is the Y word. The Y word is yield. When your focus is all on yield, you're not focusing on the right thing. I can grow anything anywhere. We can live on the surface of the moon. We can live on Mars. The problem is not that we don't know how to have the yields on the moon and Mars. The problem is that we can't afford it. And as Jimmy was showing, we have soils that are looking like the surface of the moon. If we don't have soil anymore, if we have land that looks like the surface of the moon, we're going to not have agriculture that we can afford. Again, you can grow anything anywhere. It's just if you want to put enough money into it. So when we're focused just on the one thing, everything is a trade-off analysis. Again, there's no good or bad to anything that it is that we're doing. It's a trade-off. We're going to be taking steps backwards. We're going to use tillage maybe if we need to for something. We're not going to be able to have a cover crop because it's too dry. But as long as our steps forward are more or bigger and our momentum is always trying to move us forward, we are going to be resolving the problem that we have in agriculture. So again, I leave a lot of these places and go, Jimmy and I have been traveling. I was in, well, yeah, not quite 2 weeks ago. So last week, Monday, I was in Brussels, Belgium, and then I was in Kentucky with Jimmy, and then I was over in Edmonton, and now I'm here. And everywhere that I go, it's always the same thing, is you get these people who, you know, you're looking around the room and they're excited and they're motivated and they want to do stuff, and then it's like paralysis comes over you. Where do I start? How do I get these things going? And again, if we can take the perspective of the micro and think about the soil first, that's going to help us to be able to figure out what it is that we're going to do. I'm not going to leave you with ideas on what tools to put in place. What I want you to leave with are ideas on how I can choose the tools for myself, the tools and practices. And again, that's part of the beauty of what we're trying to do with the Living Labs that we're working with Lara and with some of you producers over here on trying to take a look at. And we're doing this because we're changing the way, you know, Jimmy and Jay both made some comments about science and scientists. Good comments, not so good comments. I own it. I know, as Jimmy said, you know, he knows about this much. I think maybe he can sneak it up a little bit. If we filled this room with all of the knowledge about soil microbiology that we had, that would really be where we're at. I wake up every day and realize that I know less today than I knew yesterday. That I am always learning more things. I tell people I went to university, went to 12 years of university, got a doctorate, and as Jimmy said, when I started, we said we knew about 10% of the organisms, 10 to 9% of the organisms that were in the soil. That's what I learned. By the time I finished graduate school, we were at about 0.1%. And that number continues to go down. So I tell people I paid for 12 years of higher education to become 100 times stupider than the day I walked through the door. Not quite sure what that says about you, because you're listening to me. But the reality is that we need to take a different approach than the approach that we take with our hubris, with our human thinking. And when we talk a lot about regenerative agriculture, one of the mistakes that I think that we make is we continue to look at things from the perspective of what we were taught and from the conventional paradigm. And so when it is that we're going out there and trying to identify the tools and practices to use, if you're using that same framework of thinking, it's conventional, Y-word focused thinking, you're not going to be very successful. Jay showed, just no-till is not enough. Just checking the boxes of soil health is not enough. I was in Iowa several years ago and I met the soil health farmers of Iowa. And they were puffed out their chests. They were soil health farmers of Iowa. Yes, we're the good guys. Yeah. We're no-tillers. We grow corn, soybeans, and rye. That's what we do. And they were wondering why they weren't having good infiltration rates, why they had standing water in their fields, why their organic matter wasn't going above 3.5. You're still in that same paradigm. They took and checked the boxes. Hey, the boxes, soil health, principles. They checked at least 3, if not 4, of the 4 or 5 boxes that exist there. I'm a no-tiller. I keep residue on my field. I have diversity in my crop rotation because I'm not just farming corn anymore. And I added a cover crop because occasionally I'll throw some rye out there. KB. It is the perspective that we have to take in looking at things, again, from the soil. And so this is what I learned. And the authors, this book was published, Carol Van Ness, Fred Magdoff, published in 2000. It's a great book. Building Soils for Better Crops. This is a graphic that they have in said book. This graphic is not correct. This graphic put us under the delusion as soil scientists for us to tell you that it takes 1,000 years to generate an inch of topsoil, and there's no way you can possibly change organic matter percentages in your lifetime. And I don't know what idiot from NRCS reclassified his soil, but that person needs to be fired. Because that cannot happen. I work for the federal government, and that person should not have a job anymore. Because it cannot happen. Either that or Jimmy was really sneaky. And like, he didn't do anything with this farm. It was completely native and it had never had anything happening on it ever before. And then they came out there one day and they saw it. And it was just like it was back 400 years ago. That's what it looked like. No, this is not the way our thinking needs to be. And so the reason that I say that this is incorrect is that what we've done for ourselves is we've told ourselves this is all an uphill battle. And so it can't be done. That impossible, that just do it, that is what we need to be thinking about. That is the focus we need to have. Because here it says, we're looking at this, and roughly about 99 to 94% of your soil is mineral. 1 to 6% is organic, right? Of that organic, 70 to 90% of that organic is this stable humus. That's highly decomposed material, takes hundreds to thousands of years to form. If I were to do the math, I could tell you that there's no way, if this takes 70 to 90% of you takes 100 to 1,000 years to grow, and you're only 5% of the whole, there's no way you can change the whole by 1% in 40 years. The math doesn't work. You can't run any number out there and make that work. So again, fire them. Because that can't happen that way. This paper that I've got here, and I'm just, like I said, trying to go through this rather quickly because I want us to have a discussion on a lot of this, but this reference here, this is at least it was, a freely available paper. It's called The Contentious Nature of Soil Organic Matter. And what it did was the researchers did analysis that changed the way that we look at organic matter as scientists and the way we have to look at organic matter. So we had this traditional view that was based on decomposition, that was based on this takes hundreds of years to form. What we found is instead the microbial community can take part of this labile fraction and transform this into forms that are going to be stabilized and are going to be in our soil for decades to centuries to millennia. And that's how Jimmy got his soil, was the biological activity that was functioning off of the labile material is the plant and animal debris that's coming in on an annual basis, on a continuous basis while the plants are growing. I shouldn't say annual. On a continuous basis, you're getting that labile material coming in, but you're then getting that transformed into some stabilized material. And now, if we've got more than 50% or more that we can influence, we can actually change it. The math will work. We can get the math to work.
So
and
I
as a
can hire him
scientist,
back.
that's what I want to do. What?
I can hire him back now?
You can hire him back now. That is what it is that we're wanting to do. So again, as scientists, we need to keep learning and evolving and talking to you and understanding more about what's happening. When we look at this and the activity that's occurring below ground, one of the things, so really quickly here, this is from a regenerative system, this diagram. This is from a conventional system. And there are lines here, you just can't see them, that are connecting these groups. But the idea behind this here is these are different groups of organisms that you have in the system. Microorganisms, you have plants that are here, but mostly these are microorganisms. You have some earthworms in this system. So you've got all of these organisms. And they're all going to be interrelated with each other. And what we have here is the size of the spheres are the number of different types of organisms that are in that group. So there are millions of different species of bacteria. There are hundreds of thousands to millions of different species of fungi that you have out there. And the lines connecting the groups, the width of the lines, are indicators of the number of different interactions between the groups. So I had said earlier about nitrogen and nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation isn't just the activity of one organism or two organisms, the plant and the bacteria. It is the activity of multiple organisms. Some of those organisms create feedback loops that make it so the enzymes can't be produced by the bacteria that are fixing nitrogen. Because again, there's too much nitrogen in the soil. But they're working together in these complex activities in order for us to be able to get the functions out of soil. So again, I put this up here because we talk about, oftentimes I'll be asked, how do I get all the good bugs and get rid of all the bad? And I'm like, that's the wrong question. Because there's not good or bad bugs. There are bugs. There are microorganisms. They're doing a number of different functions, and none of them are good or bad. As Jimmy said, what they're looking for is a nice environment to live in, but primarily they need food. And how they get food dictates some of their behavior. And that behavior can sometimes have positive consequences and sometimes have negative consequences. And that doesn't mean that the negative or positive consequences are all good or bad. You want to be able to have this mixture of consequences to reactions and to actions that are happening. Mycorrhizal fungi. I was asked the question about what microbe I wanted to be, and I said, well, I was already about 90% mycorrhizal, so I might as well go all the way at the conference because my wedding ring is a diagram of a protein, or of amino acids. Amino acids make up proteins, and I studied a protein produced by mycorrhizal fungi. So my wedding band is attached to mycorrhizal fungi. My wedding vows contain words like glomalin, soil, photosynthesis, and fungi, and sunlight, because that's what it is. I'm into it, and I'm into it deep. But I can tell you right now that as much as I fell in love with mycorrhizal fungi was when I was 19 years old, and have yet to fall out of love with them, you do not just want mycorrhizal fungi in your soil. You do not want to maximize the amount of mycorrhizal fungi in your soil, because it's a trade-off analysis. The carbon that's going to the mycorrhizal fungus is coming from the plant. Carbon that is coming from the plant is not carbon that the plant can then use to be able to do something else, i.e. satisfy the Y word. It doesn't mean that the Y word can't be satisfied by their activity, but it's a trade-off analysis. Nothing is free. My spouse has a background in accounting or in economics. And so when we talk, oftentimes it's a conversation around, well, but what does that cost? And how much does this cost? And where does this go? And I'm not talking about buying fertilizer. I'm talking about how the microbes are working. What is that going to cost you in water? What's that going to cost you in carbon? How is that going to work? Jimmy was talking about adding various types of inoculum. Jimmy and Jay were talking about doing that, adding compost teas, adding those types of things. But you notice that it wasn't just the microbes by themselves. You had some molasses. Now, I'm not saying that just molasses is going to solve your issues, because molasses is a very simple sugar. Simple sugars feed simple organisms that do simple things, and that's not always what we simply want, is just simple things. Sometimes we want very complex things. We want these consortia activities to be occurring. And so people will ask me, well, why don't I just, you told me I needed to add carbon, I'm just going to add sugar. I'm just going to add milk. In the US, the milk dairy industry isn't controlled in the same way that it is in Canada. So in the US, we get dairy farmers that overproduce milk and they don't have anything to do with it, so they just dump it. And it becomes very common sometimes for them to just dump it on agricultural fields. Because, you know, you gotta get rid of the milk somehow, right? So we're gonna dump milk on there. Again, it's a simple sugar. It's a little more complex than molasses sugar, but it still is a very simple sugar. The level of complexity doesn't exist there well enough to support a large consortia activity that we're looking for. Now, the other thing that this diagram is going to show us is the color. So we've got the size of the bars. The size of the bars are the number of interactions. The really wide bars between bacteria and fungi, there are more than 9,000 interactions that are happening with these organisms, these complex webs. The color of the bar is the intensity or the strength between those organisms and how they're interacting. So how much am I attached to being just attached to the fungi? How much am I attached to being just attached to bacteria? And so you'll notice that the darkest lines are associated with these cryptostigmatic mites. And the reason is because these mites, like all mites, have a gut microbiome. Their ability to process the food that they chew up, for that food to then, those bits of food that they chew up, to get into their bodies and become part of the building blocks of their bodies and their biochemistry, is based on their gut microbiome. Essentially, like for all of us, and I sort of mentioned this when we were talking about the ciliates and the nematodes that are going to be eating, and the flagellates that eat bacteria and they give off waste. That is how all life lives, including us. We are more microbial than we are human, and the microbes that are in our guts are more attached to neurons and nerve cells than exist in our brain, because there are more neurons in your gut than there are in your brain. And they are controlling us, and they are controlling us through the waste products that they produce, through their ability to eat, to consume the food that we chew up and produce waste. We all live off of poop. Everybody poops, and we all live off of it. It's the reality of the world, people. You just got it, you know. You can literally say it, and it's true. I am full of SHIT, because that's what I am. That's how it works. So we've got to be able to have these very complex systems functioning in our environment. And what this does for us is most of the organisms in the soil, directly or indirectly, are involved in processes that are going to be releasing various nutrients in the system. Now, I love this graph, and again, this is a relatively old study from 2002 by David Tillman. But what this shows is this graph up here is showing the yield, increase in yield of global cereal yield. So its global cereal yield has increased since 1960. No doubt, right? We've increased productivity since 1960. No doubt. This bottom graph is what's called a nitrogen use efficiency curve. What this is the pounds of grain produced per the amount of fertilizer used. That curve is going down. And the reason is it because it takes more nitrogen today to produce a pound of grain than it took in 1960. You talk to your dad or your granddad or some of the other ranchers that are out there. It takes more forage today to put on a pound of beef than it took in 1960. And the reason is that the quality of the food for the animal, just like for us, has gone down. The Western world faces twin dilemmas. We are obese, malnourished human beings. in the richest countries on the planet, and we are malnourished and obese. We don't have a lot of muscle. That's what we're putting on in the animal. Can't get your rate of gain of muscle is what we're missing. We've got a lot of fat. It takes a lot to maintain this felt figure. What we've got here is an issue with the fact that we have outsourced the jobs of the microbial community. Because most of the microbes are involved directly or indirectly in nutrient cycling processes. And when we add fertility to the soil, guess what? You're not needed anymore. Go someplace else. We don't want you here. We're not going to feed you. You don't have a job. Leave. That's what it is that the system is telling the biological community. And in 1960, the reason why this curve has gone down is because the way that we looked at it was just the amount of nutrients that we were putting in and the yields that we got out. I am fairly certain that our nutrient use efficiency, especially nitrogen use efficiency, has never, ever, ever in a plant the ability for that plant to take up and utilize synthetic nutrients has never, ever, ever been above 80%. Never. More than 80% of the nutrients that are going into the plant have come from the biological community. When we started using synthetic fertilizers, even before 1960, but they really got into place in the 70s, when we started using synthetic fertilizers, the fertilizer companies won't tell you this, but in their tables, in their equations, to calculate how many pounds of nutrients you need to obtain a certain yield of grain, that table already includes a 50% discount. They already know that 50% of it's not making it into your plant. We knew that from the beginning. And I'm saying that I think it's much higher than that 50%. But what happened is in 1960, we still had an organic buffer. We still had soil that was biologically active that could buffer that system. So if we want to be able to address, again, the issues that we have related to productivity, related to nutritive quality, related to all of those things, we need to address the issues in trying to rebuild these consortia of organisms. And one of the main ways that we can do that is, again, taking a very regenerative approach to things. And when we're in a regenerative approach, it is soil regeneration. We're thinking about this from the soil first. It is soil regeneration via recarbonization, the recreation, the regeneration of soil. And we're going to do that with a systems approach. This isn't about one thing. This isn't about no-till. It isn't about cover crops. It isn't about diverse crop rotation. It isn't about a grazing animal. It is, and with those pictures that Jimmy showed with all of those different systems, it is about everything. The great thing about regenerative agriculture is everything is in play. Your options and opportunities are almost limitless in what it is that you can do. Now that's a great thing, and it's also a scary thing. Because again, what is it that we're going to do, and how are we going to choose this? I think of this again as a system, and it's dynamic, innovative, integrated, and intensive. And each of those words is defined by itself, but also together. So it's dynamic, it's responsive to various types of conditions. And when I talked about us getting these check boxes, the other thing that we like to do is we put ourselves in patterns. Work with some ranchers down in Tabor, Shipwell Feeders. Some of you may have heard of them, Blake Holtman. And they were one of the first people that, grazers that were doing holistic management with Alan Savory. Started, been doing this for a very long time, one of the first people in North America that was utilizing holistic management. And one of the things is that they have a couple of paddocks down there because, you know, it's Tabor. It's sandy and it's dry, and so it's not necessarily, it's good for growing potatoes, I guess, if you want to add a lot of potatoes, but, you know, whatever. But it's hard. It's you know, everybody lives in a hard environment in Canada. I'm not trying to say one's worse than the other. But the thing with it was even within holistic management and the way that they were supposed to be looking at their grazing operations and doing amp grazing and moving the animals around and all of this kind of stuff, they got themselves into a pattern. They got themselves into a rut. So even though they moved, they had all of these paddocks and were moving the animals, and they didn't move them in the same direction and in from one paddock to the next paddock to the next. They would move them around the ranch, but it still was a pattern. And part of that pattern was they wouldn't go out to any of their paddocks until a certain time of the year. They looked at things like, again, and there's good to this in thinking about rest and recovery, but there's also a lazy component to rest and recovery. Every organism, everything is pre-programmed to be lazy. We all are. Scientifically, we call it conservation of resources. We don't want to do any more work than we have to. Max amount of reward for the least amount of effort. That's the way that we function. Every organism functions that way, and you have to function that way. Biochemically, that's the way to be able to be most efficient. It's the way to be able to survive. There's nothing wrong with being lazy, except for the fact if your laziness is never driving an intensity to move you forward. You have to respond dynamically to conditions that happen, and that increases your intensity. What happened in our native prairies, the Canadian prairies and the US prairies, where Jay's at, it took, after the last glaciation, 40,000 years or so for that to evolve. Really nice, rich, great soils. Probably at one time were black trisomes. Everything was really good. We had organic matter percentages, I think in Canada as well, in the Canadian prairies, for most of it, you had organic matter percentages that were probably in, you know, above 10, maybe the low teens. What are you at now? Where are we at now? Where are we at now, Jay?
Something less.
Something less. We don't want to even admit where we're at now in how this is that this looks. But what we had then in that rich environment, again, that was where you could have, it was a lot of buffer for the loss of fertility that you would have, the loss of the organisms that you would have to be able to buffer that. We would have these systems that they dynamically had to respond when millions of buffalo came through. But the millions of buffalo came through once every 5 to 10 years or so, not in any static pattern. Recovery was never the same amount of time of recovery. And recovery in those systems, the reason it took 40,000 years for the organic matter to build up to that level was that the recovery was lazy recovery. You have a stress event, you have the buffalo coming through, and you have to immediately respond. It's a pendulum. We sit here, most times biology wants to sit here. We're conserving resources. If a stress event, whoosh, now I need to respond to that, and then I go back in the middle. The longer we sit in recovery, the more we're naturally going to be here. So the way that we want to look, again, at managing our systems is to add chaos. We always want to have a chaotic environment. You don't have a crop rotation anymore. You don't have winter pastures and summer pastures and calving pastures and no. None of that exists anymore. Because that's not what we need to do. We need to have chaos and intensity and the pendulum swinging back and forth all the time. Because we don't have tens of thousands of years to allow this to build up our soils anymore. What took tens of thousands of years, we got to do in 10 years or less. And the only way that we can do that is, again, to have a dynamic system that always has to be dynamically responding intensely to everything. Keeping things moving, putting stuff under stress. You always got to have energy in the system, because what we're doing, energy is about carbon. We're moving carbon through the system, as much carbon as fast as we can, on a continuous basis. We never take a day off. The microbial community, this is your largest workforce on the planet. You can redistribute your financial risks. Go to AFSC and say, my financial risk is now distributed amongst billions of organisms that are in my soil. They're taking the risk for me. Don't know if they'll listen and adjust your load on that. But we're getting there in having these conversations and realizing that that's where the risk lies. Again, that graph that I had, that is where the risk lies. Back in 1960, the risk was on everybody else in the soil and not on us. We can go back there and utilize that. So what is that we're trying to do? So I'm going to talk a little bit quickly about the living labs. I know I keep saying quickly. But with the living labs, where you're part of, Lara is part of, the Alberta Regenerative Living Lab. There are 2 of them in Alberta, and one of them in, well, 2 of them in British Columbia, but one of them in the Peace Country of British Columbia that also covers some of the Peace Country of Alberta. So it's a little mix here. And what the government has done, federal government has done, is given money to start looking at agriculture, but the idea of a living lab is that it's supposed to be farmer and rancher driven. You are telling me what to do. I don't tell you what trial I want to set up on your farm or ranch. You tell me what it is that you're doing, and I go out there and I take samples and try and take a look at it, and then it's on me to figure out how to put the statistics together to understand what's happening. And I know that Kelly has reached out to several of you. Kimberly Cornish and myself have been around the last couple of years talking about this program. We just got funding. Well, we got funding back in April, but we actually got cash now. We got money, finally. You know how government things go. Doesn't matter if you're in the States or if you're in Canada, government things go the way government things go. So our goal is that we're going to take about 18,000 samples from 1,500 locations, different sampling points across about 150 to 200 farms and ranches across the province of Alberta over 5 years. And we are going to be looking at, we're doing this primarily to look at soil carbon, because again, that soil, that's what's helping the buffer to help to manage so many things that are happening. We're also going to be looking at some soil biogeochemical processes and some nutrient data and other things like that. And the goal of this is to hopefully validate the claims of regenerative agriculture, but not to focus on practices. Again, it's about outcomes. It's about what it is that you see, what it is that's happening, and not, I did no-till. I did cover crops. Sorry, no puffing. Hate to say it. You don't get to puff your chest. But what we're going to be looking at is these outcomes. And what we're hoping to do is that it's going to allow us to visualize data that can help us to preserve the grasslands, because we know the value of the grasslands, both in Canada and the United States. And we want to look at how we can leverage our grasslands to help us to look at things like avoided conversion. Stress of converting to cropland, rangeland to cropland, and stress of urbanization. How is it that we can look at what's happening in the system and leverage what's happening in that system to help us to have a good data-filled argument against the pressures that are coming on to agriculture. So that's what it is that we're doing. Again, we're looking in the whole entire agricultural zone. So we do have plots up in the Peace Country as well as with the British Columbia, the BC Living Labs. So all of the white zone in Alberta is where we're taking a look at. And again, what we're trying to do is understand some things about climate change, but more importantly, looking at some things like water movement, increasing biodiversity, improving nutritive quality, healthy food, all of those types of aspects. Many partners that we have, again, Lair is a partner. I think all of the ARAs and forage associations, I don't know, because I'm relatively new. I don't know if there's any that aren't. I know Kara is sort of indirectly involved, but not totally.
Kara and Herman's Butter.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm trying to learn my Canadian lingo. I'm getting close. Zed, I'm gonna do Z a bunch of times probably and not do Zed. I apologize ahead of time. Anyway, so we've got a variety of partners that we're working with. Again, we've gotten some funding in the past, so I'm going to talk a little bit about, show you some examples of some of the data that we've gotten with some of the funding that we've already had in place for a while through the ESCC program and through ARDAR. And then, as I said, we recently got funding through the Living Labs program. And so that's scary. So we're going to leave that. That's also scary. But we're going to talk a little bit about this. So what we're trying to do is what's called predictive soil carbon mapping. And again, instead of things being practice-based, saying you do this and we know that this is, you're going to sequester this much carbon, we're actually going to measure at these locations that I talked about. So at those 1,500 locations that we're looking at, we're going to measure the carbon as well as other soil parameters at those locations, and we're going to utilize that data as well as a bunch of other geospatial data to get an idea and be able to predict what the carbon will be at a landscape level. So just to give you an idea, when we are determining where it is that those 1,500 sampling points are going to go in the province of Alberta, we are utilizing, so Kelly has been working with you to collect polygons or land locations for your farms and ranches that we want to be doing sampling on. The number of samples we take is going to be based on a sampling design called conditional Latin hypercubed, as well as a design called feature spaced design. And the idea behind there is that we are utilizing all of this information that comes from geospatial data to identify where there are unique locations on the landscape within those polygons. So if there's a unique spot, that's where we go. Roughly, we're looking at about 4 samples per square kilometer, but again, it doesn't completely equal out that way, because in many places, it's very similar. There's not a lot of unique locations. We've got an innovative sampling tool that's going to allow us to be able to collect down to 1 meter deep, and we're collecting soil samples right now so we can go out in frozen soils. We're actually thinking, because, you know, we're a little bit masochistic, we're going to go out soil sampling in the Peace Country, because that's the place to go in January and February. But that's going to allow us, we've got obviously more agricultural land in this area, in central and southern Alberta, so it's going to allow us to be able to get all of our sampling done this spring as well in the rest of the agricultural land. So that's why we're going to be up in the Peace at that point in time. And it allows us, with the tools we use, we can sample on various types of slopes and be able to get a sample that is going to be going direct into the ground as opposed to angular just along the topsoil, so we can get a good depth. We've got a number of different types of analyses that we're doing. Again, the way that it's looking at the design, it takes temperature gradients into account, because we know temperature gradients are existing across the province, not just north to south. We're also looking at precipitation gradients, similar type of thing. And in our first round of sampling, we did various locations throughout Alberta, the agricultural zone, and so this is some of the data I'm going to show you. Obviously, there's a hole here. So we didn't have anything in this first round of sampling that we did that was in this area. But what I do want to show you, so again, this is sort of our data sets. I'm going to skip over a couple things, because one of the things I do want to show you, and come back to a couple of these, is, so despite the fact that we didn't sample in this area, this was from Google Maps, kind of giving us an idea. Obviously, St. Paul, we're here, so giving us an idea that we're going to be encompassing that. We did get predictions based on our sampling for this area. So this is sort of like having baseline data. It's sort of our first cut as to this is what we think is happening there. When we get the additional samples, it's going to help us to confirm what it is that we're thinking we're seeing, what's predicted there. The white spaces that you have here, this is where we don't have enough data at all to be able to do mapping, or where there are cities or other things like that. So this white space here is probably a lot of Edmonton that you've got there. So we've got holes in our data set. This is for the top 30 centimeters. This is for 30 to 60 centimeters. And again, the more red your color is, the higher your carbon content that we're looking at, your higher organic matter. So this is 30 to 60, and this is 60 to 100. Again, this is all based on prediction, based on the data we've collected elsewhere. So as we get farms and ranches into this, what this again is going to allow us to do this is on a very large landscape level type of interpretation, and that's going to improve our statistics. Now, the one thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit here is some of the interesting data that we've gotten so far from what we've done. So again, we were looking, all of this white stuff here is where we didn't do, it's not agricultural land. So there's no measurements there. So as you look at the maps, they don't really look, they're maps of Alberta, but they don't look like maps of Alberta. So I just wanted to kind of give you that reference so that you understand it's the agricultural, the white zone of Alberta that we're looking at. These are the predictive maps. This is in just the color. So the whole idea here was this is the color of the soil. So that's why they did it in the browns, but it's hard to differentiate. So most of the maps we've got various color ranges there. So we're at 0 to 15, 15 to 30, 30 to 60, and 60 to 100 in that range of what it is that we're looking at. And again, what we found, some of this data that we've seen so far, is that total down to 1 meter, we've got 20 to 364 megagrams per hectare of carbon. And our carbon stock, so this is soil organic carbon stock. What is that? Oh, tons per, that should be tons per acre. That should be tons per acre at the bottom there. Sorry about that. So this is in tons per acre. This is in megagrams per hectare. And this is our CO2 equivalents. So again, if we're looking at this from a climate change standpoint, they want us to look at it from a CO2 equivalent. So 534 tons per acre down to a meter of CO2 equivalents that it is that we're able to have. This is what we have in our soils. This isn't telling us about the additionality. So when we're doing our resampling, that's going to help us to project the additionality, what you might get with the various practices that you're doing. But this is telling you what your resource is, what we have. And when we're talking about pressure to convert land and avoided conversion, this is a way of saying if you convert this to cropping, you have the potential to lose all of this carbon that's in my reserve. So what's going to be happening there when we're taking a look at that? So again, just kind of wanted to give you that perspective. One of the things, this is some of the really interesting data that we're taking a look at on the different types of carbon that you have. So this is basically a scientific analysis of what type of carbon. So where the chemical shifts, so where on this graph you see a peak is indicating a different type of carbon molecule, because not all carbon's the same. So you have, what I showed that pie chart, you had the carbon that was stored for a longer period of time and that could be stabilized, but then you also had carbon that was labile that could be turned back over to CO2 very quickly. And so what we're trying to figure out is what's happening to help us to store carbon deeper down into the soil. So 1 through 4 are the different depths of soil that you have. Carboxyl carbons, which are the things that are between 220 and 160. And what we do is we measure the amount of space underneath the line. And that gives us a percentage of the molecules that are in that group. So in here, the carboxyl carbons, the important point of this is the carboxyl carbons are things like carbohydrates and amino acid carbon, protein carbon. And usually that is supposed to turn over very, very quickly, because there's a lot of carboxylases and a lot of proteases, a lot of enzymes in the soil that are going to break those down. And we need to have some of those get broken down, because that's again how we get nutrients released, because there are nutrients that are tied up in proteins and in carbohydrates. And carbohydrates are also food for the microorganisms. So we need to have those things that are happening. The aromatics, those are going to be things like your tannins and your lignans. They're the benzene ring. And they're going to have a level of stability. The next thing we've got here are the O-alkyls. And the O-alkyls are like your cellulose and your hemicellulose. And the O-alkyls, again, when we're looking at decomposition, these are going to get decomposed quickly. These are supposed to get decomposed next. Then the aromatics, and then the alkyls themselves are your hydrocarbons. All right? What we've got here are 3 different systems. We grouped the farms we looked at, farms and ranches, into groupings of systems. So we've got ant grazing, adaptive multipaddock, we've got cropland, and we've got rotational grazing. Now it's a little hard to see there, so if we look at it here, again a very busy table, but these are our depths, and these are the types of compounds, and this is the percentage of those different carbon compounds. Now what's extremely interesting to us as researchers and to moving this forward is here with ant grazing, the percentage, not just at the surface, that are in these alkyls, the cellulose, hemicellulose types of compounds, but what's also down to 100 centimeters. And we are building, so this is really us getting, it's another confirmation from what we see from color and what we see from carbon content, is we are building soil down deeper. We're building that, and when we do that at those depths, those are the things that are going to be more stabilized. So normally what you would expect in the way that we envisioned this decomposition model is that most of the stuff should be in these hydrocarbons, these alkalins, and most of them, that should be at depth, you should have probably 70% of them that way. And we don't see that. The data doesn't show that. So it really supports this fact that we can regenerate and change this in a very short period of time. And again, when we're trying to make these arguments to policymakers, to lenders, to anyone that's out there in trying to understand what's happening, the fact that we're getting this type of data is really going to help us to be able to reinforce what it is that we're trying to do with this management. And again, we can see that with the cores that we take. So this is down near Tabor. This is an amp grazed pasture that I had talked about. You can see, the color difference in those soils, but also the structural difference that you've got in those soils. This is row crop, mostly onions and potatoes, type of row crop production that's done on that land. And when we take a look at that, again, you can see this is where the cropland is, and this is where the rangeland is. We've lost, you could say we lost soil, but we've probably lost some soil to erosion, but more importantly, what ended up happening was we lost porosity. So we went from this to this. And that makes your soil shrink. When you don't have that pore space, that open space, your soils, again, you don't have that spongy texture that's raised up. So you're going to be losing that.
Would some of it be due to compaction?
Well, it's compacting it, yeah.
Versus
It's
the cow or the oxen plowing?
yeah, part of this is compaction that you have with equipment and other things like that,
Right.
as opposed to the animal compaction. But a lot of it, again, is the removal of sort of the aggregates and that structure that's creating that
For
porosity.
sure. Okay.
Exactly. That you have there, because you can see that difference there. This
Yes.
is
Yep. For
this
sure.
is that kind of a thing that you have. And so this is from the mapping that we did there too, in looking at the cropland versus some of the grazing land. Again, we need to adjust a little bit of here to get a better resolution on this, but we are getting more carbon being stored in that top 30 centimeters in our grazing lands than we are in our cropland. Even in dry land, it's irrigated crop agriculture and dry land grazing in Tabor. Very sandy soils. Yes?
Can I get you to just back up a couple of slides to that chart? I always equated carbon with organics, and the plow horizon I would have thought would have been 0 to 15 centimeters, so you would have had the highest numbers right along the very top, and then
Yep.
distinguishing. But I'm looking at 60 centimeters and deeper, and that's really high carbon percentages. It just doesn't make sense to me that carbon is that low in our soils.
Right, and again, this goes to the management that you have. So you have roots that are going to be going down deeper that can be providing some of those O-alkyl carbon compounds that are there. So these carbon compounds are going to be primarily coming from roots. And so being able to get roots down deeper into the soil and taking a look at that. But these carboxyl, these are sort of your root exudates. And again, we would have expected more of that, like you're saying, to be at the surface. And what we're finding with these grazing systems,
A really
especially with the
healthy
grazing.
example, or very, very healthy.
Yes, yeah. We're getting that down in there and creating that soil health. So it's not what we expected at all. And what we're finding, again, this equates to that porosity and the bulk density. So what we're finding is that we're getting low bulk density numbers, but that's because we've built up so much porosity that's there. We've increased the amount of, and when we're doing, that's part of the problem when we do this type of mapping, is carbon stocks are based on the weight of the carbon and the weight of the soil and the volume of that soil. And so the more porosity that you have, the lower your carbon stock automatically is. Your percent organic matter, so in some of the soils that we looked at some soils at Tomahawk that were under, actually there was a couple of places we looked at Tomahawk that were sort of under one of the prairie potholes. So we sampled in there, and that in that area we had organic matter percentages that were 35%. But because that soil was so porous, because of that high organic matter percentage, the stock is not that much higher than the stock that you would have in adjacent cropland. But we're still seeing a measurable difference between the two. So, here we've got 98 tons, and here we've got 100, almost 150 tons of CO2 equivalents. But again, this is a lot more porous, and so the overall mass to volume ratio, the bulk density is much lower in those soils. But again, going back to this, the health of that soil is getting much deeper. And even in some of the soils where you wouldn't expect it, with some of the cropland soils, we're really seeing that healthy soil is a big component of what it is that we're looking at. So we're going to be, this is sort of just a start. This is a tease on what's going to be happening over the next few years. And again, as we integrate Lara more into this, our hope is we're going to have better resolution on this map. And we're really going to be able to see that, removing a lot of that white space and not having as much predictive involved in it. The one thing that we did find with our prediction, though, is that this process that we're doing, we have a pretty good relationship with the precision and the accuracy that we're looking at. So the R-square value here is 0.6. A lot of people would be like, well, that's a sucky R-squared. I want, 90%, 95%. What we're looking at is over 52 million acres. And to have an R-squared, a prediction from 450 points that gives you an accuracy of 0.6 on 52 million acres, is pretty significant. And when you look and you review this stuff in the literature, we are at the top end of that level of significance of accuracy. This CCC value that you have here is our precision. So we're looking both at accuracy and precision. Are we accurately predicting what's there, and is that repeatable? Can we be able to get that number back every time that we're trying to do this? Because every time we take a soil sample and we make measurements, this goes into, it's a machine learning algorithm, and basically what it's doing is it's running millions of different correlations between all of our data. We have about 250 pieces of geospatial data and about 40 pieces of ground truth data for every point that we have. And with that, it's constantly running correlations to see what are the best relationships. So it does, millions of different correlations, and then comes up with values to use. And it's an iterative process. Again, instead of me saying for no-till, you get 0.3 tons of carbon just because you do no-till.
Okay.
It's not saying that. It's saying, everything that you're doing, maybe no-till gives you 0.09 today, and because you've got all of these other things. But I go over to your farm or ranch and I'm like, you get a 0.2 for no-till because of all of these other things that you've got going. So it doesn't give a constant coefficient. It's not a static coefficient for a practice. And that's why we're trying to do this without imposing practices on you. And going to sort of this discussion of practices, this is kind of the last thing that I want to talk about, because I want to use these guys while they're here. Like I said, I can come back. So utilizing them while they're here, I want to look at some of these soil health principles and this idea of, again, taking a framework that comes from soil, not a framework from our above ground conventional thinking. And when I think about the soil health principles, I have 6 soil health principles here. Some people will talk about, usually there's 4, sometimes there's 5. Occasionally there's 6 soil health principles, and the 6th soil health principle that's been talked a lot about is context. And when you're thinking about context, to me that's an overarching perspective. And the context that I want you to have, I think there's only one context that matters, and that's the context of the soil. The context of the soil and soil biology. Because that's our problem. Your context should be what your problem is. Addressing that problem. How do you go about doing that? Maximizing photosynthesis, this doesn't mean you have to plant more seeds per acre. What it means is we want to keep something growing as many days of the year as possible. You are in Alberta, Canada. The number of days that you can grow something is 280 minimum. If you're in the Peace Country, I'll give you a little bit of credit for being in the Peace Country, and you get 260 minimum. Doesn't mean that they have to be consecutive days. But in a 365-day year, the sun shines 365 days. If you're growing something, only 280 of those, you're already taking 85 days off. If we're carbon challenged, if our problem and the way we get carbon is through photosynthesis, and you take 85 days off, you've already screwed yourself. I'm sorry, but that's just reality.
I thought our frost-free growing season was only about 106 days.
It's not about temperature. There's a difference. We can have, so when we're talking about frost-free days, one, you're talking about consecutive.
Yeah.
That's not the point. The point is not consecutive days. And when we're talking about frost, there are many plants that are frost tolerant that will grow even after you have frost. So what we're looking for is how you can keep something that's growing. And even under snow, we've done research studies, and you can have plants that will grow under, I think it's up to 3 inches or 4 inches of snow, that you can still have plants that are going to be growing. So the idea is that we need to be looking at the plants that we're choosing a little bit differently. I like corn. My dad is a corn farmer. Again, corn is one of the things that I frequently use in this example. Corn is a perennial tropical grass that we annualized. Do you know what latitude you're at? If you're going to argue with me about latitude about 280 days, I'm going to really argue with you about growing a perennial tropical grass at this latitude. I mean, what kind of idiots are you? We got to think about what it is, the plants that we're growing differently, and not growing to the Y word. The Y word is not yield. It's not that level of productivity. Our problem is soil. So if we address the problem, the other issues that we have can be addressed. So again, maximizing the amount of time that you have something growing. Diversity comes in both microscopic and macroscopic forms. Cover crop diversity can help to offset some of the less cash crop diversity that you might have. Microscopic diversity from adding various types of inoculants can help to offset some of the lack of diversity that you might have in your soils because of your plant diversity. Animal diversity is a big part of this as well. It's diversity at all scales. We shouldn't limit ourselves in a checkbox to, I'm the no-till corn, soybean, rye grower in Iowa. We have to look at things from a systems approach and much more complexity. I'm going to skip this one for just a second. Go here to managing micro and macroscopic livestock. We need to have animals on the landscape. Does that mean that all of you need to go out there and buy cattle? No. Does that mean that all of you need to go out there and buy sheep? No. Does it mean that all of you need to go out there and buy chickens? No. We need to have an integration of animals, which doesn't mean, again, macroscopic to microscopic. It doesn't mean that they all need to be large grazing animals that we put into a herd. We can manage grazing, and that's a great thing, and there's a lot of additionality to that, and that can help to get that pendulum going a lot more. But we can challenge the system and add stress to the system that a grazing animal will add through other animals. Birds, bats, bees, insects, all of them do some sort of stress on the plants that are growing. That's what grazing animal is about, is having something that is giving stress to the plant. We do manage grazing because it's about managing that stress. But it's not about not having the stress. And again, the stress can come from a lot of different sources. So looking at how we can integrate that more into the system. Again, the more that you integrate that, the more you can keep that pendulum going, and swinging, and the bigger swings you can get at, but that doesn't mean that you have to have all of those things be a part of it. Reducing or eliminating tillage or soil disturbance. Conservation agriculture, no-till agriculture, I think has really overplayed its hand. And again, because it's not about no-till. The soil does need some level of disturbance. It's about stress. Tillage is just an overstress. The types of tillage that you do, the tools that you use to do tillage, the frequency at which you do tillage is an overstress. But that doesn't mean that stress is all bad. Nature does natural tillage anyway. If you want to do some tillage, you don't want to use a mechanical tool to do it, manage your herd to do it. I was talking to a rancher, I think it was when I was in Kentucky. We were talking about this, and he was, he's got this issue where he's got a lot of mint in one of his paddocks, and it's toxic, and you can't have the animals eating that. And he's like, I don't know what to do. I can't get out there with a mechanical tool, and I don't know what to do. And I said, well, one of the things you could do is actually, where you have the highest concentration of it, put your single wire around that area and run the animals through. And do it at a time when the soil is probably a little bit moist, because what you want to do is tear up the roots of the mint. You don't want them to eat, so you want to run them through. And high density, shoulder to shoulder. Greg Judy talks about shoulder to shoulder things. If you want to manage an area, it is about managing that area. It doesn't mean that you have to put in an herbicide or you have to do this or that. Everything is a tool, macroscopic to microscopic. The mycorrhizal fungi are tools. Everything is a tool. What we choose to do with those tools and how we choose to use them is what's important. Greg Judy talked about the fact that we shouldn't name our animals. I don't care if you name your animal, but you treat it as a tool. And I don't care if it's, the most expensive Craftsman tool that you had or the cheap thing that you bought at the gas station. If the cheap thing you bought at the gas station works and the Craftsman doesn't, throw the Craftsman away. You look for choosing the tools that work within your system. Doesn't have to be the most expensive thing. When we're talking about the microbial community and amendments to add, again, not about good or bad. When you're talking about those types of organisms to add, it's not about adding the best. When you're fielding a team, when you're putting the hockey team on the ice, you don't want to have all the best players, because that's not what's going to win you the Stanley Cup. What's going to win you the cup is how they play together, the consortia activity, what's happening. It isn't about having Wayne Gretzky's as all of the players. That isn't what it is that you want to do.
You need to tell the New York Yankees that too.
There are a lot of teams that have overpaid, as we all know, for things that don't actually give them the series, or the Super Bowl, or the Stanley Cup, or whatever it is that you're looking for. Because that is not what it is that we're trying to do. We're trying to work with a complex consortia that I know about this much about. And I think in my hubris, that with this much knowledge, I can tell you what to do. I'm not that stupid. Armor soil protection. The best thing that you can do for the soil surface is to protect it. Manage it, till it, have the animals trample it, whatever, when that is required and when that is needed, but then keep it protected. And the best protection you can have comes from a living plant. Residue is great, but the amount of energy, solar energy, wind, water, the amount of energy that can be absorbed by dead tissue is minuscule compared to the amount of energy that can be absorbed by living. The ability to cycle water and evaporative cooling with living stuff is so much greater than what you have with dead stuff. It's not to say the dead stuff isn't good. I mean, you know, if you've got a thatch, stick your hand under there, it'll be cool and moist. Wintertime, it'll be kind of warm and moist. Either way, it's good. But if it's living, it's got much more advantages to it. Reducing or eliminating synthetic or off-farm inputs. This is the outsourcing of the job. This is the stressors we miss. This is the things we don't think about. We grow our crops. We're doing hydroponics. Crop growers, you're doing hydroponics outdoors. And you put your crops under glass. And let me tell you, when we're talking especially about nutritive quality and nutrient density, that does not make a nutrient-dense plant. Antioxidants, polyphenolics, complex biomolecules are stress biomolecules the plant produces in response to stress. The tomato that had green leaves inside of it was harvested when it was green. Put on a truck, exposed to ethylene, and it ripened on the truck. Yay, it's nice and red, it's beautiful. Really pretty color. But when it does that in response to ethylene, it doesn't produce the antioxidants and polyphenolics that give it the color and the texture. One of my biggest issues, I have a lot of them, one of my biggest issues, I do have a lot of them, I say one of my biggest, I'm not going to say the biggest, one of my biggest issues is that we care more about the quality of the soil that is used to produce the feedstocks for alcohol and the feedstocks for our animals than we care about the quality of the soil that produces our food. Alcohol, tea, coffee, and animal feed are directly connected to the soil, but nothing else that we consume is. The texture, the flavor, that wine, that texture that you have, that you wanted, all of those phenolics in there and that good. Seriously? It's alcohol. I like it, but who cares? In the end, what really is going to be in my body and feeding my gut microbiome is the other stuff. And I don't connect it to that. Again, it's one of the things that really drives me nuts. My dad is a farmer, and we talk a lot, and man sometimes can have a little bit of an issue with me. So one of the things that I want us to discuss, and we've got about a half hour left, in the next half hour, is sort of thinking about decision makers. Again, not telling you what to do, but maybe helping you to figure out a way to frame your thinking and making decisions. So it's not about should I put in cover crops? Should I till or no till? Should I rotate with this, add this crop to my rotation? Should I graze this way? Should I put this fence up? It's about why. Why? Why am I doing that? What is it that I'm trying to address? And one of the things we can do with why is if you ask yourself why 5 times, you will often come to the heart of really what it is you're doing and why it is that you're doing it. Why? Because an idiot told me to do this. Why? Because I know I need to do something different. Why? Because what I'm doing isn't working for me. Why? Because it's not working with the soil. Why? Because I haven't thought about the soil and soil biology. Asking yourself why, and then how you're going to do it, and what are the consequences of what you do. Again, nothing is all good or bad. It's 2 sides of every coin. It's always a trade-off analysis. Everything costs, nothing is free. So what are the consequences of what you're doing? When is it going to be most effective or have the least negative consequences? Time and timing for everything that it is that you're doing. We're not put into boxes. You're farmers and ranchers, you're Renaissance people, you're innovators. You're not people that could be boxed into an office. And the reason is because you're not good at boxes, but somehow in the agriculture that exists today, you have put yourself in boxes and confined yourself to something. You have almost limitless options and opportunities. You can dictate your time. Time flies for all of us and it's difficult, but we have options and opportunities to help to dictate that.
I don't mean to interrupt, I
Yeah.
agree with you, but at the end of the day, there are uncontrollable factors that drive you to do what agriculture is doing today. Economics, yield, and I love
Right,
what you
yeah.
say about
No,
yield, right?
right.
But at the end of the day,
There are
the
drivers.
rancher has to be kept happy.
Right. There are drivers, and we do have to be responsive to our drivers, but we also have a lot of choices to be making along the way in how it is we work with that. And so part of the decision framework is for you to figure out, I mean, again, we can't control the rain. We can't control the snow. We can't control, absolutely, I understand that. But we have ways to be able to look and make choices that are going to help us to help to reframe things in a way that will still allow us to be able to get what we need, but not say, I have to do this. This is not what I have to do. This is what I choose to do. And where do I choose to do it? Again, like I was talking about with the grazing, if you have an issue in your paddock, don't just say I ant graze and I made small paddocks in there. Make a paddock where the issue is. Put the animals in there like that if they need to be. I was up at ranch near Manning, and we were up there Soil Health Day with Gabe Brown and Alan Williams and David Brandt. We're all up there a few years ago, and it was great. So I'm going to tell you two really great things. One, if you ever get the opportunity, sit down and watch your animals. Not just your animals, but all of the animals. They're your animals. The birds, the bats, the bees, the spiders, watch all of them. Take some time out to see what's happening. Do that in both your rangeland and your cropland. So we were up there, and Alan Williams was going to speak. We were out in the pasture, and Alan Williams was going to speak. So it gave me the opportunity to sort of sit there. And I just sat there because what they did was they moved the animals. They were doing amp grazing. They moved the animals from one small paddock to another paddock. But they were going to be gone for a few days, so they didn't have the opportunity to move. Usually they move multiple times during the day. So they wanted to make that paddock just a little bit bigger to have the animals out there for a couple of days. And in the meantime, while they were working on, the farmhand was working on laying out the larger paddock, and Alan Williams is starting to speak. And so what they did was they just made a small paddock in a particular area that they had an issue and had them just there so the animals were around where Alan Williams was talking. And they had them there for just like an hour or so. And then they let them out. But you'll be amazed at the change in performance with just doing something like that for an hour or so. And Greg Judy was talking about this yesterday too, of the same thing. We can change and address some of those issues that we have and that we see. We just need to think about things differently. And again, the holistic management, creating paddocks, why does this paddock have to be exactly that same size all the time? Why do you have to do it this way? Yes, I know that there may be issues as far as laying out fencing and all of that kind of stuff and where your water is, but nothing precludes you from splitting your water tank in half or putting it in one time on this side and putting it in on this side. You don't have to move the tank. You're just looking at thinking about things differently. Like, we put all of these options. Sometimes I'm like, just have an index cards, write down on index cards all of the potential options that you could have and group them. If you want to group like different crops that you could have, group warm season, grass, cool season grass, warm season broadleaf, cool season broadleaf. Have that all laid out, stack of index cards. What am I gonna plant? Pull out a card. Yeah, I can't do that. Pull out another card. We want chaos. We don't want us creating a static choice. We want to mix it up all the time. So again, looking at how it is that we can mix things up. So one of the things too to maybe help you sort of think about this is I was thinking about this, Ray Archuleta talked about this FIST acronym of frequency, intensity, scale, and timing. And so the frequency is the number of times that a tool or practice needs to be used. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes that's a bad thing. I was talking a little bit about nutrients and that we have the greatest nutrient demand when the plant is going through the reproductive phase. Could you spread out your nutrient application? That means the tool you chose was adding fertilizer, but now I'm going to add a type of fertilizer at a certain level multiple times. Frequency, number of times you do something doesn't mean that it's bad. If you have more number or less number, that's not what it is. It's about figuring out how does that address my issues with time management. How frequently do I have to, am I looking at moving? I shouldn't say do I have to. How frequently am I looking at moving? What if I change this up? And again, part of it is with holistic management, it isn't about having this many days of rest and that many days of grazing. It's about here, there, everywhere. How is it that we change things up? Changing that frequency. Intensity, the amount of force that's needed. When I'm in a row crop situation, do I have to drive the tractor at full throttle? If I'm tilling, can I put it into a lower, what is the impact that's going to happen if I go at a lower speed? What if I use a disc or a chisel? If I use a high-speed disc, but I go at low speed, what happens? How are these things having a differing layer of impact on the system in choosing what's going to be happening? So for each of these, the question becomes, is this adding carbon or is it taking carbon away? Because we're looking at this from the soil perspective. Adding carbon, taking carbon away. Is it enhancing or not? And it's okay to be not, or it's okay to take away. But again, you want to add more in the end. It's the forward momentum. Timing. Talked a lot about timing. So one of the things that I guess kind of laying this out in a framework, and I don't know if this will work or not in my own head. I'm kind of doing this and I'm going, yeah, I can think this out. But what I would like to do is I want Jay and Jimmy to come up here, and I want you all to give us one or two issues, and for us to maybe think out how we would go about addressing those issues. So,
after you, Jimmy.
putting us all on the spot to say, what is it that you would do? Because again, thinking out scenarios, I think, can help us to think out what it is that we might do. So I don't know if we want to leave this up or turn it off. It doesn't matter, I guess. All right, so.
Okay, just a general comment,
Yep.
slash question, if I may. And
Yep.
You just touched on it a couple minutes ago. From your presentation, I take it that soil is everything.
Yep.
So how come we can produce vegetables hydroponically?
Because we have analyzed some of the chemistry of soil, and we add that chemistry synthetically to produce. The issue that we have a lot of times with that is that we aren't getting the same level of quality. We're missing many of the antioxidants and polyphenolics, so it's not just about being able to produce that. And there's also, as I said, I can grow anything anywhere. I can grow stuff on the surface of the moon. It's the cost variable. So the long-term cost variable of trying to grow everything hydroponically that we need, and to grow it with a diversity of nutrients that are supplied at the right times to make all of the complex biomolecules that are needed to give us healthy food, is not sustainable. neither fiscally nor environmentally. Does that make sense?
You asked the question.
It's a bad idea. We can't afford to do it, and we aren't gonna get everything we want out of it.
So you're living in Calgary, I'm sure you've heard, apparently, that there are, I don't know, small high rises, low rises
Oh, yeah.
that are being converted into hydroponic operations.
Yep. China's doing that in massive scale. Because we don't have enough soil. That isn't going to mean that we are going to be able to feed people, 8 billion people, long-term, and allow us to be able to continue to live to 70 to 80 years old. It's a trade-off. You can do it, there's just a trade-off to that.
You might feed them, but the feed might not be sufficient.
Right, so, you know, you're not gonna live to 70 to 80 years old.
Okay, so have you actually analyzed lettuce that's grown hydroponically versus lettuce that's grown in the soil?
I have not personally done that, but I have looked at studies and data that have done that. And there are a couple of issues, one of which is that oftentimes the way that they will make those comparisons and measurements to that is they're looking at total elemental concentration of various elements. It doesn't matter if you have calcium in your lettuce. It matters the molecular configuration of calcium. And so just because I have a high concentration of calcium in my lettuce, because I added that hydroponically, doesn't mean that my gut microbiome can process that lettuce and release that calcium. And the reason I'm using calcium as an example is back in the 80s when people started talking about osteoporosis and calcium deficiencies. And one of the first calcium supplements that was on the market was basically ground up shellfish. Because shells, mussel shells and clam shells, have a high concentration of calcium carbonate. The highest concentrations, and it's a waste product. Hell, it was cheap and easy and you could do it and you had a lot of it, might as well use it. You can't buy it anymore. And the reason you can't buy it anymore and you can't buy calcium that way, and when they talk to you about calcium deficiencies, you're supposed to get it, you know, with other types of biomolecules and other molecular configurations because our gut microbiome can't process that calcium. So it isn't always just, and in hydroponics, it's really easy to increase the concentration of an element, but not to increase the form of that element to make it bioavailable. And that's a big part of what is missing in this hydroponic production is we said this is what we need. These are the nutrients you need to have plants. These are the nutrients you need that animals need. This is the concentration we need them in. It's like, you know, synthetic fertilizers. We do hydroponics outdoors in conventional agriculture. This is what the plant needs. It's in-out thinking, but we're not thinking about what we're really putting in and how that's going to be used. And on top of that, there's a huge environmental cost to be doing that. But, you know, I'm from Calgary, I get it. Like I said, China's doing it at huge scale. But, you know, when you have, what, 2.5 billion people to feed, and you've lost pretty much every bit of soil you have, are you gonna let them starve, or are you gonna let them die slowly?
No, you let them buy coal for $50 a bushel. That's how you do it.
Straight up. Thank you for the question. You had a comment?
No, it's the same with a lab-grown meat then?
There are some things with lab-grown meat that you're not getting the same types of biomolecules that you get with meat that comes from animals. And it's the same, you know, grass-fed versus grain-fed. There are different nutrients that are made based on how the rumen processes, how the gut processes whatever it's fed and what it uses to create that. So, you know, you have different things. It's a trade-off. We may not get everything we need from lab-grown meat, but we may get We may figure out how to do it. Part of my issue with that is we're using this much knowledge to try and do something that what we need to know fills the room. So, yeah, how will we do that? All right, so who's got an issue? Not a problem, but an issue. What is your greatest concern this spring, young man? Looking at you.
Who's a young man?
I'm either an equal opportunity insulter or I'm an equal opportunity non-insulter.
Look, you don't
I
have
do
as
this-
much
I do
gray.
What are you scared of? What's most worrying you? All right.
What are you, I'm not quite sure what you're looking for, water infiltration? Like another, we've had 2 dry years in a row, what's next year gonna bring?
Yep.
So does that start you off on the
Yeah.
right direction?
Problem is what? Your issue is water. You're afraid you're not going to have enough of it and you want to get better infiltration.
Yeah,
Right.
so-
Better infiltration and hopefully better holding capacity, not just infiltration. So,
And I think too, when we're looking at all of those issues, et cetera, I always take a look at what are the natural systems, you know, that built your soils, and what did they consist of? Because really, the natural systems usually hold a lot of the keys. And then if you're looking at a cropping system or a grazing system or the garden, then there's answers in there that, you know, a person can apply, and it's your landscape. And so I think a lot of times it lies in there somewhere.
so what type of an operation do you have? Livestock,
Livestock,
Grain.
cattle,
cattle,
cow-calf operation,
cow-calf operation, okay?
multi-generational, it's over 100 years. I have photos back over 100 years ago of acres and acres of water. And we're down to, this year's the driest that I've seen in my lifetime.
So how have you changed operation from them first photos till today? Has anything changed on the operation?
Everything has changed.
Okay. Give me an example.
They put in a drainage, 2 different drainage systems. One, they modified the natural creek to make it straight instead of having puddles everywhere. Now we've got one straight creek goes through there. And then they did a drainage system about 30 years ago to connect a bunch of puddles to drain them all into the creek. So yes,
So they messed up the hydrology in the prairie potholes.
yes,
To get rid of the water,
yes.
then,
Now we want it back.
now you want it back.
That's a reoccurring theme. I'm visiting with these individuals from Denmark, and you know, they're working on a project, and they were explaining it to me. I said, what are you doing? Well, he said, we're putting the meander back. And he said, we're the same group that took it out 50 years earlier or whatever it was. Now we're putting the meander back. Because the beavers used to do these things for us in this country. And one day it got fashionable to wear the beaver on your head, I guess, in Europe or someplace. And yeah, no Okies. And that changed the whole scenario, but the water hydrology, all the things that used to, all the benefits that would come from it. So if we got a way to put the meander back, or the beaver back.
Or the beaver back. So, you know, what would it be that you would do to try and support better hydrology? A lot of that is going to be based on, you know, you're not going to go out there and disconnect and rejig the water, the drainage system and all of that kind of stuff. But natural hydrology, you have animals that are a part of helping to manage the natural hydrology, and you have plants that are part of managing the natural hydrology. So what is it that we could look at with the forages that you have and that you're using, and the way that you're using the forages to get them to manage water flow differently? So, you know, Jimmy talked about, as the plant is getting into the reproductive phase, that it's going to be using a lot more water. When we're looking at managing our forages, how much can we keep it from getting into that reproductive phase so that it's not losing a lot of water, it's needing a lot of water, but part of that is so water goes into reproduction and those reproductive parts are lost from the system. So we want to keep it in the system and how we're managing it. So you lose a lot of water in reproduction because reproduction takes a lot of energy, so you're doing a lot more work. The plant's doing a lot more work to do that. So if we could manage and time that when it goes into the reproductive phase, can we change the way that the plant is using water?
That's the reason I asked you the question, what had changed in the last 100 years? And so when you told me, you know, about the drainage systems, I immediately, you know, it's kind of like Jay said, so you're taking the water out of the system, now you want the water back. So that's now what you need to focus on, is how you put the water back. And whether plants can help and manage the difference of plants. Maybe the drainage that you got, you need to put some small blocks in, like beaver dams simulated, to slow that, once you get it back. I mean, it's going to rain sometime. I don't know how dry it is now, but put some small blocks back into the drainage system to try to simulate back to where you were before. Because as you slow that trend of that drainage down, remember I talked about least resistance, you start building that capacity back out into the drainage from that, instead of just piping it straight on through. And that's the reason they're doing that in Denmark, is putting the meander back into the drainage system that they took out, because they're all focused during the wet period of the 80s, in that time frame from the 60s to the 90s. We were in a wet cycle in America, and I'm sure up here as well. And people, you know, got to get rid of it. The system, the mechanism, that was the bank for the dry period coming of the water. And so try to think about how you would put the meander back and put some blocks in there simulating the beavers to start building that profile back. Would be the first thing I would consider. And then managing the plants.
Managing the plants. Also potentially managing the animals in such a way. So again, adding a meander to it, the way that you have the animals managed, especially around where you have existing water right now, how can you manage the animals to help to potentially add more meander to that? Are there ways, I mean, you know, we don't necessarily like making trails, but can you make a trail in a way that is going to, with the animals, allow for the water to get back to that basin that you have? So it's opposite thinking of what you want to do, because you're basically trying to create a river channel or a stream channel. You know, we've got some snow, you know, those types of things now. When that is melting, how can you get it funneled and meander to where it is that you want to get it?
Yep.
Are
Also
there
think
ways
about
to change
snow
that?
catch.
Snow catch, how can we manage snow catch?
Make sure you got enough residue in your rangeland, in your cropland, to maximize the snow catch. Put the water back. Don't graze it so short. And I don't know your operation. I'm just thinking out loud here. That's things that we've done. I mean, I've had county commissioners say, well, it doesn't snow. It didn't snow as much as your place as it did, and he just lives 3 miles from me. It's like, what are you talking about? He said, well, the roads are blocked over here. See, and he's not even thinking, and he's the guy that will gripe about how dry it is. So, once again, you're trying to put the water back. So think about all forms of water that's coming through your place, where it's snow, where it's rain. You know, how do I slow it? How do I capture it to load the system back up?
In our grazing systems, we're gonna trample most, but not all. We always have some vertical structure. And I think the vertical structure plays a role. We get a lot of wind, and even in the wildlife arena, I think this vertical structure plays a role. Most of it's trampled to the soil surface, but not all. And I think that makes a huge difference on how the environment functions.
We think of shelter belts and stuff, these massive trees that we built and put up, which serve a great purpose, but you can't imagine how much residue that's this tall can do for the surface, or half this tall, in the amount of wind and erosion that's on that surface. So, you know, we've locked ourselves into what we think is supposed to look right. And when we see all this blowing soil, we want to put up this huge barrier 30 or 40 feet tall, when really all we need is everything this tall to really help. So it's that perceptional thinking that's got us in what we perceive as beautiful, you know, as a straight single cropped field, that the rows are straight.
Well, in the first 4 phases of agriculture, I think that was what we did. We simplified the landscape, made it more efficient, right? It was a lot better when we got done with it. Yeah. And in this phase of agriculture, like I mentioned in the opening, this is the phase where we need to turn that around, and so we get to function with the soil aggregate and with diversity and the recarbonization, so that when this big effort is done, and there's a lot of money going to change hands potentially, when this big effort is done, we got the right thing, we got the right products. That's the big concern I have. I want the right things to come. I want some nutrient-dense food to come out of this thing. Because if we miss somewhere's in that whole chain, if we start missing items, you know, if I look at cropping systems, I look at the local diversity and the natural systems. How do I bring that diversity into a cropping system? How do I bring it into a cover crop? How do you build an aggregate? I'm always asking myself, am I building aggregates? Because they don't last long, you know, a few weeks or a month or whatever. They don't last long. So you're always rebuilding, right? It's a building and a rebuilding. And so you start asking yourself those questions and everything that Kris went over and Jimmy went over, and how do you make that? You got to make it work in your environment. What I do at the Minokan farm, that's not your system. Right? Your system's going to look different. So you start putting that together. If you get the opportunity to come together as a study group, think about it as a study group. If you can tolerate each other, you know, and if you can come together as a study group in this room or any other place, I think that's when you can really start to put some of these things together to make it happen in your environment.
Well, and I would say, you know, you've got, again, as Jay was talking about, with looking at what you had, and you've got the history, you've got visual photographic history of, because we're in a lot of the prairie pothole areas, and you've got these areas where the hydrology of the natural landscape after the glaciation, the last glaciers left, is incredibly complex in this environment. And again, we simplified it and we took it out in our hubris and said, water is water, and as long as I can see water someplace on my farm or my ranch, that's good enough. And it's all gonna go, I'm gonna make this dugout, I'm gonna do this here, and this is where I want my water to be, and not where everything else wants the water to be. Again, are there ways to look at how you could manage some of the plants and animals to maybe create some of those small potholes in different places on your ranch, as opposed to trying to get it all in one place. Because that's, again, what we did and how we got into simplifying things. The landscape that we have in this environment is a landscape where you, again, had these little places of water so that the animals, you know, it's the way that animals live when you have predator and prey relationships, so that you didn't have all of the prey having to gather at one water hole and get attacked by the predators. It's, again, there was a huge diversity in the way, and that changes the way that the hydrology is. And as we build up organic matter and build up structure, that's going to help us to be able to manage a lot of the things with creating the way that water is going to be moving in that landscape. You know, again, looking at and you know, Jay shuts his eyes when he drives in eastern North Dakota, from Fargo to Grand Forks. I just run around and say dumb S word as I'm driving along, and it is because they're not managing the hydrology. It's a lake bottom. It's a lake bottom, and you didn't manage the hydrology of the lake bottom. And then, you know, I used to live in North Dakota as a taxpayer. I spent a lot of my tax dollars went to putting in tile drainage when they weren't even going to get down to where the tile drainage was, because it's a lake bottom and they're not managing it right. So, you know, it's one of those things where we have to look at the complexity of the environment that you're in. And I said, you know, you can get a lot of snow in Fargo and Grand Forks. What you need to be doing is having some winter cover crops that are going to overwinter and going to be able to get going early in the spring and start pulling water down, so that when the snow melt happens, you're pulling it down. Because what you get is you get the water that just sits on the surface.
Okay,
And then you build up the salts.
I don't mean to interrupt, but
Yes.
I have a question. If you're talking about all the science behind it and explaining what it does, we need to know how to do it. And, you know, we're not scientists, we're not, you know what I mean? And how do we do this?
So that's why I'm saying, right, so I'm saying.
What do I plant in September, October, when we're done harvest? And then so that it carries over to the winter, and then have a short spring, and then we put our next crop in and do the cover crop? Or do we take our hayfield, like Murray was saying, like you take a pasture that has been beaten up forever, and okay, I don't have a direct till machine, I don't have roller, what is it called? Roller crimper, you know, I don't have those things, right?
So I would look at plants that would grow in this environment. And we tend to think that a plant that's successful is massive on top. I can plant cereal rye at home up till January. And I'll get it up and it'll be this tall all through the winter, under the snow, whatever. But when you dig that up, I may have a foot to a foot and a half of roots on a plant that has 4 leaves and a top on it. And everybody tells me, well, you're an idiot, because you wasted all that money and you have no forage or no growth up on top. But when you really dig and look, I'm doing a lot because I'm feeding the system. So don't focus in on how much I can grow it in the middle of winter. What can I keep alive? And how can I capture this sunlight to feed down below, to build the aggregate, to make that work? So I would look at things that you can get up after harvest or plant it but before harvest. Use tools that you have available. So if you don't, then you're gonna have to plant afterwards to get something that will come up, germinate and come up and grow and stay alive as long as it can. Now, I'm a long way from home. But I know that if you looked at the natural system that was here, there was plants in the native prairie before we messed it up that done that. And so I know that you can do that again. You just gotta sit down and do that research out. And that's the reason I talked about the people that helped me.
Right, yes.
Get somebody here at the research farms that will help you figure that out. That's the key.
And watching how, again, watching how animals act, watching how plants act, looking to, you know, some of the prairies that are around there. Are there ways for me to put those things in place? Again, you know, we're talking about snow catch, but there's also a tremendous amount of value to having something that's growing in the spring. Something that can, as Jimmy's saying, overwinter, grow sometimes. I grew up in Minnesota, we always talked about the Chinook winds. I never understood what the Chinook, what it meant, where Chinook winds came from, because we would have this warming that would happen in the spring. The Chinooks came from here. Why don't we take advantage of some of the things that are naturally existing? Yes, we don't always know that we're gonna get snow every winter. Sometimes we have open winters. But if we plan at least somewhat for, again, having something that is going to be growing in the spring, that's going to be putting those roots down and trying to pull the water from the snow melt down, again, to manage hydrology differently than what we're the normal way we're looking at managing hydrology. When you're looking to, you know, there was a producer yesterday who was talking about Sizer milk vetch, and he had a huge crop of Sizer milk vetch in one of his paddocks, and what he would do was basically use the animals to seed Sizer milk vetch in another paddock. Feed them there, move them so that they poop over there. We can, you know, in the same way that I was talking with some ranchers in BC a couple of years ago, and I said in the same way that, you know, you do like putting things on the hides of animals to control pests, we can put seeds on the hides of animals. If you want to be able to have them out on the range distributing, and, you know, with our pastures, there is no reason not to add annuals to your perennial pasture. The future of agriculture is not just perennials in our cropland, but it's annuals in our rangeland. Because natively, that's the way that it works. There's annual plants in native range. Why do we tell ourselves in our tame pastures that it has to be perennial?
So how this works is I've now found an expert that has an answer to your question.
So there's
No pressure there. No pressure.
So there's a couple perennials that work for us. And winter camelina and cereal rye are two that survive in our environment. And they're good starters. I look at them this way: if we put them in the fall and it's a dry fall and they don't come up, they'll still come up the next spring. Okay? They'll come up slower. If they don't come up that fall, they'll come up slower. But that basically tells me, because then I get 2 swings at the ball instead of 1. Okay? The other thing about a green plant from a plant physiology viewpoint, the first 4 to 8 weeks of a green plant's life, it's going to give off the exudation into the soil. Okay? That's the sugars, that's the food. So if you can get 5-6 weeks out of that plant, you got the liquid exudate. You got a big part of it. Okay? That, and Jimmy said, that's not going to be a real big plant. That's going to be mostly rootments.
Yeah.
And that's really what you're after. Then you had some success. And so then if I have the grass, I'll put my low carbon crops like my canola, pinto bean, soybean. They're going to go into that grass. The winter camelina would be an easier environment for me to use maybe corn. So, you know, because, you know, plant, you're still looking at basic agronomy. Don't forget basic agronomy.
Yeah.
You know, a grass into a broadleaf into a grass, that helps you from viewpoints of diseases, etc., and gives you the crop type. So, yeah, there's a million ways But those are kind of starter areas, if you will. And the other thing that we've always done when we set out to make a mistake, we set out to make a small one. And you know, when you try that, pick out a field. Pick out a field and stare at it. And that gives you, you know, if it worked, it gives you a little confidence. If it didn't work, you change that, change your procedure. So.
I mean, there's a lot of, too, with different crop types mixing it together, there's a lot of innovations going on. I mean, you know, Piola is now a crop. Mixing peas and canola, that's, you know, it's intercropping. Derek Axton over in Saskatchewan was looking at, there's some really interesting things that go on, again, with utilizing different crop types together, the way that those plants exchange various types of nutrients. So one of the things that Derek Axton was looking at was with flax, and flax has a tendency to be able to exchange a lot of micronutrients with different plants. And one of what we're thinking is going on, and we've got a little bit of evidence of this, but not quite enough yet, is that boron is one of the things that can help to manage maturity. And so what Derek has done is he has mixed flax and canola and done that and harvested them at the same time, which you shouldn't be able to do that because flax matures before the canola does. But what happens is the flax seems to be able to manipulate the concentrations of boron so that it delays the maturity of the flax and at the same time increases the maturity of the canola so they actually do finish at the same time. He's also done it in the opposite way with doing flax and peas together. And so speeds up the maturity of the flax, slows down the maturity of the peas depending on how you're allocating boron, and therefore you can harvest them together. You know, we've got a lot of things too that I look at stuff and I'm like, this is an engineering issue that we could look at dealing with. And John Deere did not design the no-till tractor. No-till tractor was designed by you guys. That's what happened. These innovations in tools and engineering come a long way. I was working with some farmers in Norway, and they had, again, short growing season. They were trying to grow a cover crop, roll it down, and they looked at they didn't want to ship a roller from the US because it was too expensive to ship that to Norway. Nobody was making rollers there, so they decided one time in the middle of winter to make the roller in their shop, and the directions for making the roller are on the internet. They looked at the directions. I'm not going to say there was a little bit of alcohol involved, but I suspect that was the part of the issue because there was a little bit of an issue in converting English units to metric units. Okay. And so the roller that they made had a smaller drum. And what ended up happening with that smaller drum is the shorter stature cover crops that they had, it would allow them to get the same number of crimps in there that the larger diameter drum was in the US version. A farmer in Iowa is working with Dawn Equipment Manufacturers that is doing similar types of things in modifying equipment. There's a farmer, Jason Mock, who worked on putting in where he's growing wheat and soybeans in the same field, not adjusting the maturity rate, but he's out there able to harvest the wheat and on the soybean rows, so it's alternate rows. On the soybean rows, basically they look like sleds, and they're on what's called flexi fingers, so they move up and down, but it's basically just a sled that pushes the beans down. And if you know anything about soybeans, when they get to be other than really little, if you do anything to that top leaf, they're done. They're pretty weak as far as that's concerned. Don't hold up to hail very well. Oftentimes it's pretty tough, but the idea was he knew that, and so being able to push them down and keep it so, he would cut the wheat high, stripper header, and then just have that where it just sort of pushed the beans down, and they're, filling back in those rows where the wheat was. So sometimes it's, again, thinking about tools a little bit differently than the normal way that you use them. And that, kind of going back to the animals and the plants, is the animal can be as destructive as a tool to the soil as you need it to be, and as regenerative as a tool.
It's
And that's
all-
where there's no good or bad, it's what do I need you to do now? The plants can use water at the surface, and they can use water going down. Plants can take nitrogen away from the surface, and plants can take nitrogen away from deeper down and pull it up. Looking at, again, what it is that's gonna fit. And, Jimmy mentioned too, there's a huge volume of information, in the US, but also in Canada, with some of the applied research associations can have access to this. Some of the old research, AAFC and Ag Canada research centers that I worked at, the station that I worked at in Mandan was over 100 years old, and we had an archive of all of the information. And one day I just decided to go over there and look at what some of the first people who were growing crops there, what it was that they grew, what was growing there, what the indigenous populations were growing at that time. It's a little bit tougher sometimes here in this part of Canada, because a lot of the indigenous tribes in this part of Canada were more hunters than they were agriculturalists. So, there's not as much of that information. But again, over in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, there's that information. There's that information in the Dakotas on that side. There are books that are out there. I know, I don't know, Jay, if you've read Thomas Jefferson's.
I have.
But, some of the first farmers in North America, what it was that they were doing. And even going back to, some of it we know, some of the first farmers were Vikings. What did the Vikings do when they came here? How was it that they managed things? So there's knowledge that's out there. It's not knowledge that I have, but it's trying to think about things differently. And I guess that's my big point with it is sometimes, like I said, with the index cards, or you put labels on a Dungeons and Dragons dice, a 32-side dice, and put it whatever number comes up, that's the number that you go in your little book, and this is what it is that I'm going to look for right now. These are the choices that I'm going to be making.
So, like the gentleman in the back that showed us the photos from your crop production this year, those were phenomenal. Something like that moves the carbon needle.
Growing 3 things at once.
That's why if you can share these systems amongst each other, that way you could all fail together. But those were phenomenal looking, because there's diversity, and there's diversity in your natural systems. Something like that is very likely to move the carbon needle for you.
And it's amazing when you grow them together, how they do mature at the same time. And it's also like soybeans, if they're by themselves and you hurt them, they're done. If you hurt them when you're harvesting another crop in them, they rebound very quickly. So they act differently, just like we act differently, whether we're in a group. Sometimes I want to say something, but if we're in a big group, I want to. But if it's just Jay and I talking,
He runs right over it.
yeah. So plants act the same way as we do. So it's finding them in this area that can achieve them goals that you set out, and how you reverse the ranch back where it can function the way it did 50 or 100 years ago. We call them potholes. They're really portals that was supposed to recharge the aquifer. That's the reason when Kris measured them, that the carbon levels were so high. And what we done, we took the potholes, or we tried to take them all out, and when you take the surface water out, you affect the groundwater. And so that's the attack that we made on the system Now it's like, crap, we need the water back.
Yeah.
So it's looking at history, it's looking at the avenues that we have, but it's understanding the true systems function before we were here and what we taken out. And so that's the reason I asked the question, what it was 100 years ago, so that you can start thinking about how do we put it back. Can we put it back exactly? If I take a tractor apart and don't label it and it's just scattered all over the shop, I get it about halfway back together and like, So we're not going to get it exactly right. But once again, it's a learning opportunity, and we just got to keep thinking. The best thing you can do, and what Jay was getting on this, is everywhere I go, we try to link people together with the tools that they're comfortable. Is it a meeting like this? Is it a text group on the phone? Is it a WhatsApp? I'm in a 25 group WhatsApp with Derek Axton and people from Australia and the UK. I'm also with 4 producers, 3 in Kansas and me. I'm on multiple groups like that gives me the ability to connect the guy that knows what can grow here.
Form a team, that's what we did. We formed a team.
Sure.
We got together and we set aside our differences and formed a team and said we can't keep doing what we've been doing. So we changed, but it's a lot easier to do together and bounce ideas off and support each other and figure it out. And then we would pick a different topic each time we'd meet, and we'd take a look at a topic, and maybe one was soil aggregates, maybe one was carbon, maybe one was organic matter, one was CN ratios. We'd pick a different topic, we'd self-educate, and we'd bring in expertise, bring in Kris or whoever, and for that item, and that's how we did what we did. I'm gonna take my wife and go to Saskatoon, so it was really nice visiting.
Party on, Kathy.
Saskatoon.
Saskatoon. You told me I'd never take you anywhere. You're taking me to Saskatoon now.
Real quiet drive.
Maybe just give these guys a round of applause. There are Solaris surveys on the back table. They are available online, which would save me a lot of time for I not have to input your answers into our system. It is up if you complete it by January 31st. You're up for a draw for a $50 card. And last year we did give away a book, so maybe I'll look at Jay's recommended reading list and grab a book to add to the prize for filling out the survey. If you did fill them out today, please put your name on it and a contact information. So that way, if I pull your survey for winning, I can actually get a hold of you. So thanks again for coming. Thank you for joining us through all our events throughout the year, as well as have a Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Make sure you take the rain gauge.
I grab 2.
County bylaw officer stopping by regularly, as I'm always.
Well, he had a work deadline on Friday, and I know he missed a couple of his phone was ringing. No, he didn't leave. He's the, well, I don't know, actually. Maybe interesting.
Oh, I know, but
Thank you again. Thank you for coming.
Winter and enough summer or whatever, right?
Please take pie and muffins for the road.
Oh, he's not. I understand. Like, I know, somebody that was behind the tractor. See, because we need to stop for the winter, so I'm partly, but like, or whatever, right? Even if it comes up with something. Oh, yeah, no, I know, technically he had tried some, and it actually worked. He came up in the fall, and he got, did some grades there. Swat grades.
There's a couple of producers here, trying to make it.
Oh, yeah. I can't remember what it was.
Bigger scale, on a larger scale, so I'm hoping to kind of get some of those.
Yeah.
A little bit of rain.
I know.
Y'all heading out?
I did one last year and
Have a good drive. I hope you make it home to Bismarck sometime. They've had a blizzard going on there the last few days, so they've been tracking. Take care of yourself.
that's why I kind of
Okay, buddy, this is it. Let's go.
The big thing for us is, her dad has hammered degrees. We're trying, like, if you say, well, just do this, and next year it'll be better. No, we're gonna take her there for a year. She's gonna have it. This thistle takes off because the high in nutrients, right? So this is really bad. what's under, freezes next night.
Thank you.
Good to see you again.
Yeah. And I bring my son, and my son is kind of pushing me, so
Yes.
that's good.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
It's very good.
And I think the native grass, that's all that he's done, right? We were Italian ryegrass, something, right?
Chris,
Yes.
if you want, there is an extra room at Jimmy's Hotel. If it feels like it's too much,
feels like
roads
it's
get
too much,
traffic,
yeah.
stay. Like
Okay.
I have 2 rooms there, so I didn't know that Jay was going that
You
way.
didn't know that Jay was
Taking
going-
it.
okay,
So
okay.
there's a second room there for you. if you
Okay,
want it.
okay, I will definitely consider that. It's,
Yeah, I don't know.
it's been a haul, to be honest. You know. It's kind of like I keep going, one more day.
Yeah. It's